Now it's time for us to take a look at what is called the BIOS. And the BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. And the BIOS is the first thing that your computer sees when it boots up. It's the first thing you see, and it's the first thing that the computer sees. So from your perspective, you'll see a screen flash on. It might have the logo of the computer manufacturer. There might be a couple of symbols there, and it kind of churns away. And what's happening, though, as the computer is seeing its first thing too, the BIOS is like Grand Central Station and like having a great engineer there saying, okay, there's my hard drive. I'm looking to my hard drive for my operating system so that I can boot up. Hey, there's the keyboard. The keyboard is where I get the input from the user, and the mouse too. We need some input there. And where are we going to put that input? Well, we're going to send that input to the video card so that our user can see it in the monitor. So that's all the stuff that's happening when the BIOS boots up. It's actually the first piece of software that runs when your computer starts. It's a chip, it's a system manager, and a data flow manager. Now, you might be thinking, wow, the BIOS is kind of a powerful thing, and it really is. If the BIOS doesn't start, there's not anything else that can happen with your computer. Now, the BIOS, though, can also be a back door into the computer, and it's something that not a lot of folks have taken a lot of care to take care of. So we want to make sure that you have that understanding so that you can take steps to protect your public machines. What we want you to do is make sure that your public machines are password protected on the BIOS, so that it would require a password in order to enter the BIOS. Some BIOS have two passwords. One is to just access the BIOS on boot up, and another to change the BIOS settings. Now, I want to caution you as well about settings in the BIOS. This isn't something that you want to go in and just kind of willy-nilly change because the firmware of the BIOS has the capability to be updated, but it takes a special process, and if something fails during that update, you can actually damage your computer. And so be careful. So also when you're looking at these settings, remember to take care with BIOS settings. It's possible to kind of accidentally make things not work like you want them to. So we're going to just point to the things that we think are safe for you to look at. But if you don't feel like you know what you're doing, or you don't feel confident, be careful with all other settings in the BIOS, because it could lead to difficulties. So now let's explore the BIOS together. Now, to get into the BIOS, you have to do something kind of quick and a little tricky sometimes, and that's you have to kind of catch it. The way that you catch the BIOS, in other words, the way that you can enter the BIOS as you're doing the boot up process, is usually hitting a special key. In our case, we need to hit the F12 key immediately as the computer is booting up. Now, once we get to that boot screen, we will see another option in order to enter the BIOS. This one's kind of complicated because it's a machine that was designed to be used in an enterprise environment. So it's got lots and lots of options. And of course, enterprise environment, when it comes to computing, typically means the type of computer that's used in a place where there's lots and lots and lots of computers being deployed. So there's lots of different ways in order to manage those computers from a central location to make it a little easier on the tech folks who are working on them. In this case, we are going to go into the other options, which is at the lower part of the menu, that is called BIOS Setup, and then simply hit the Enter key. Once we enter the BIOS, we're going to go to a screen under the General tab that tells us an awful lot about the computer itself, and it's called System Information. And this screen, in this case, in this BIOS anyway, tells us a lot of really, really cool things. It tells us the version of the BIOS. There's different versions, of course, of all software, and we want to make sure that we have that we know what version is running on here. We're not asking you to update the BIOS version, but a computer professional might ensure that the BIOS is updated to the latest version. And this is how they tell. They come into the BIOS and look to see what version it is, and then compare it on the manufacturer's website to see if the right one is running. Another one is the manufacturing and sales dates, which are kind of cool to take a look at. Just by looking at this, we can see when this computer was purchased and when it was shipped. shipped when ownership was taken. And so that's a interesting thing, and so maybe something you don't think about, but it's a nice thing to refer back to at time. We can also see the type of memory that's installed. We can see that both of our DIMM slots, that's for our RAM, we have a DIMM A and DIMM B. We can see that they both have about 2 gig of memory and that they're full. Now, this tells us something very, very interesting. If there was an empty slot, we would have another indication of a slot and it not being full. So if we needed to upgrade the RAM on this computer, we can see that we would actually have to replace one of those DIMM chips. We'd have to take out that 2 gigabyte chip and then put in something even bigger if we wanted to increase the memory. The other thing here we can see that's very important is the type of processor. And we can see this is an Intel Core i5, but as we've learned elsewhere in the class, it's very, very important not just to look at a generic marketing term like i5, but also look at the specific model number of the processor. And that's where this is where we see the specific model number right here. Now I'm going to move to a different screen that tells us information about the battery. Since this is a laptop, we have the BIOS is also monitoring the battery itself and seeing what's happening. And something kind of cool is happening. I want you to look at the display, especially where it says AC adapter. And right now the unit is plugged in, and so we're getting power from the wall and it's in a charging state. But I want you to watch what happens when the unit is unplugged. There, see the difference? See the change that happened very, very quick? This is an example of the sort of monitoring that the BIOS is capable of doing, and this is a very powerful thing. That's why that BIOS chip is so important. It really is keeping track of all of the action that's happening within the computer, making sure the right bits are going to the right bits and pieces of the computer. The screen we want you to look at is really important because this is a place where we want you to make changes, perhaps, on your public PCs. You don't need to do this on your staff PCs, but we would like you to look at your public PCs, or to have someone who helps you with your computers look at your public PCs to make sure that this is in the correct setting. On this computer, you can see that almost everything here is checked. Now, boot sequence means what does the computer look to and in what order to boot up. When the power is turned on and the BIOS comes on, where does the BIOS look to find an operating system to load onto the computer? And so that's what's described here. The setting that you see here with everything checked is just fine if it's a staff PC. If this is a public PC, though, we want you to make sure that it can only boot off of the internal hard drive. And so in the case of this being a public PC, we would uncheck everything except for the internal hard drive. Again, we want to emphasize that all BIOS have different configurations and different appearances, but they all have things in common. This is something that we do want you to change, and that is to ensure that there's an administrator password, or however it's described on your BIOS, that would prevent anyone from just getting into the BIOS and looking at or changing the settings without knowing that password. Now, of course, with any situation where you have a password, make sure it's written down in a couple of places, and it's written down in a couple of places where you can get to it, because unfortunately, if you lose your BIOS password, it's not an easy thing to recover. You would have to kind of start from scratch, and a professional would have to help you do that. I don't encourage that. So just, write it down, have it in a safe place, and everything will be just fine. But on this screen, this is where you will be able to kind of steer to the area of your computer where the password can be entered. Once the password is entered, we can try the boot sequence again, and you'll see that you cannot get into the BIOS without entering that password, and that provides a wonderful layer of security for you. So thank you for taking a look at this simple look at the BIOS, a simple look at changing the boot order and entering a password. And I hope that you go and check your public PCs right now to see if this is something you need to do in your library.